Hasn't the Christian religion been responsible for many wars?
You can't blame religion for most wars. And in fact, only 2% of the deaths from wars can be attributed to the religious wars.
Wow, that is very key, and I don't think people hear that very often. Was the church responsible for creating and spreading slavery?
So often, the critics of Christianity attack the Christian West for something that wasn't unique to Christian West, which is slavery, but they refuse to give credit to what was unique, and that was the abolition of slavery.
People say that Adolf Hitler was a Christian. What is wrong with this picture? Many critics of Christianity falsely accuse the church of all manner of evils. Now, Dr. Sarfati, you have earned a PhD in science, and you have studied Christian history in relation to culture and science. Is it true that the church is responsible for all kinds of death, wrongdoing, and impeding science?
Well, a lot of the stories that you hear about and probably learn in the schools are actually false, completely false. Others are exaggerated, or else they're not put into proper perspective, like compared with what the non-Christian regimes have done over history.
So with that in mind, I want to look at some of the examples from the critics, what they say about Christianity throughout history. Let's start with, did the church teach that the earth is flat in the past?
Now, that's one of the great myths put out by anti-Christians. And unfortunately, in American public schools, they've learned all about Washington Irving and the story of Columbus sailing around the globe earth, and all his critics believed in a flat earth and laughed at him. That was totally untrue, because almost everyone in the church knew very well the earth was a globe. Only 2, maybe 5 people, obscure people, taught a flat earth, but the overwhelming number of Christian scholars who discussed the issue taught the earth is round. You can go to the Venerable Bede in the 8th century, so 7 centuries before Columbus. He said explicitly the earth is a perfect sphere, and just to make it very clear, he says not circular like a shield, but round like a ball. Okay, very unambiguous. Then you go to Thomas Aquinas, the greatest theologian and apologist of the high Middle Ages in the 13th century. He was talking about how do you prove something, and what does he do? He pick something extremely obvious and well-known. That's the roundness of the earth. And he said a physicist proves it by one means and the astronomer by another. He thought it was so obvious that he didn't need to elaborate. That was right at the start of his big Summa Theologiae, the standard theology textbook of the Middle Ages. Then even things like the symbols, like the royalty, the rulers had a symbol called Globus Cruciger, going at least as far back as the 7th century, which is a cross-bearing globe, a golden globe. See, the cross was Christ. The ruler holds it in his hand to symbolize his rule over the domain, but the globe symbolized the earth.
Wow.
Okay,
yeah.
So hang on, a globe symbolizes a flat earth? Okay, obviously he expected his subjects to understand the globe was a symbol of the earth, so expected them to know the earth was round, okay? And then there are even some of the popular stories of the medieval times. You have the Romance of Alexander, you have King Darius III of Persia mocking Alexander, sending him a ball, meaning a child's toy, but Alexander takes and says, well, this ball is a prophecy, I'm going to rule the whole earth. Okay, so they expected the readers and their hearers, their listeners, to know that the earth was shaped like a ball. Otherwise, what would be the point of what Alexander said? So it presupposed it was widely known.
Yeah, and this is not an issue we just hear from the critics towards the church, but it gets around in the church within is also listening to those critics concerning this conspiracy.
Yeah, but it really just some knowledge of history shows that the roundness of the earth was extremely well known, and basically it was also very well known in the Middle Ages. Things like that the distance to the stars was so vast that the earth was a tiny speck by comparison. That was well known right throughout the Middle Ages. Okay, and then you got other things they knew very well. The moon didn't give out off its own light, but reflected sunlight. They knew that.
Yeah.
Well, one of the popes in the 10th century said this and assumed it was very widely known by his hearers. Okay, so a few things you think that, the medieval people, the earth was big and the universe was tiny. Well, no, they knew the earth was a speck compared to the distance of the stars.
Wow.
They knew the smallest star we see is bigger than the earth.
Okay, well then looking to another example, I wanted to introduce Galileo because he is considered a hero figure of science, and he stands up to the church as the voice of reason and science. So what is wrong with this caricature?
Oh, just about everything. Well, the first thing is the Galileo dispute was really science versus science. I mean, the church actually had the science of its day on its side when they taught the earth didn't move. After all, you can't feel it moving. I mean, all sorts of problems with a moving earth. So hardly anyone believed in a moving earth in those days. Okay, that's one thing. They understood Galileo had not proven his theory. He thought the tides proved his theory, but the tides happen twice a day, not once a day. So total bluff. Okay, and I'd actually almost challenge anyone in the audience, okay, if you're skeptical of this, okay, you prove the earth moves, but you're only allowed to use information and equipment available in 1633, the date of the trial of Galileo. Okay, if you can't do that, then do you have any right to attack the church for actually sticking to the science of their day? Now, the thing is, the church also didn't care. Say, 1613, Galileo was very well known for promoting his theory. The church didn't care. They didn't care about Copernicus back in 1543. Leading church people encouraged Copernicus to publish. The Pope himself was quite keen to see the ideas and was quite keen to see Galileo's ideas, okay? But Galileo did a few things wrong politically, like he tried to tell the church how they should interpret parts of the Bible. But hang on, this is the counter-Reformation. The Protestants said we could have the people, we can read it. That's what we would agree. Right. But the Catholics said, well, no, we're the only ones who can read Scripture, understand Scripture. And yet Galileo was telling the Catholic Church how to understand. He was basically being a Protestant at a time when there was a big battle between them. Okay, that was one problem. Another issue was that he was told not to treat it as proven fact, and it certainly wasn't proven fact. Okay. Yeah. It was actually seemed to be quite absurd what he was saying, but he disobeyed that decree and treated it as proven fact. And there's a possibility that he was mocking the Pope as well. I mean, because he had a dialogue. We had a guy representing his view, a guy representing the Earth stationary view, which he called simplicio, which means the fool, and the Pope recognized one of his arguments in the mouth of the fool. Okay, so that's one theory. I don't know if it's totally proven, but that's a possibility. But we do know that the Pope, who'd been one of his best friends, they had a big falling out. And so Galileo was known danger in 1613 when he published On a Moving Earth, but then 1633, what had changed was not the moving earth, but the politics of the time.
Okay, well then let's look at another example that the critics like to throw out. Did Christians oppose James Simpson on anesthesia for childbirth pain?
Okay, there's a book, some books in the 19th century trying to invent a history of warfare between science and Christendom by Andrew Dixon White was the main offender. He was the founder of Cornell University as an explicitly secular university, but he made up this story about lots of opposition to childbirth pain because, see, James Simpson basically used chloroform as an anesthetic and thought, but he really cared about women. Well, maybe we can alleviate childbirth pain. Now, it turns out he was worried that some people might think, well, God said to Eve, you're going to have pain when you bear children. So would some people think you're going against God by relieving it? So he had an argument, which was that God put Adam to sleep to make Eve out of his rib. Interesting. Which means he used anesthesia. And there's also the other precedent that Jesus' healing miracles were alleviating effects of the curse, like curing blindness and deafness, dumbness, lameness, blood flow. All those things are the result of the curse, and Jesus alleviated those because God said we're going to die, we're going to be sick and all that, and Jesus alleviated that and was clearly a precedent for us to do that sort of thing. But when it turns out that no Christian of note made that objection, so you have some Christians saying, well, and this was during the heyday of the Industrial Revolution, all these labor-saving devices being invented. And they said, well, okay, God said to Adam, you will get your bread by painful toil, sweat of your brow. And no one had an objection to labor-saving devices relieving that painful toil. So why should we have objections to relieving the childbirth pain? Okay, but there were some scientific objections, like chloroform is a new substance. Is it really safe? And now we say, well, no, it's not really safe. We don't use it anymore. But that was an objection to the means, not the principle of putting women to sleep. And the other issue is like drunkenness you are not in control of your faculties, and maybe under anesthesia you're not in control. Maybe it's the same sort of moral issue. And also, could the woman follow instructions properly if she was under, whether to push, whether to breathe, okay? Mm-hmm. Those was a scientific and moral, but they were not biblical ones, you see.
Right.
So the biblical objection just didn't happen. No Christian of note you can trace making this objection.
Okay. So for these first few examples, I feel like these have been the easier ones to ease into the subject. Mm-hmm. And now we're going to approach the tougher things, the ones that the critics have saved to really clinch the arguments. So first, I'm going to say, hasn't religion been the cause of many wars?
Well, okay, I could go through a few wars which are well known, and probably the most destructive ones are World War I and World War II. And more recently, you have the Rwanda genocide killing 800,000 people. Okay, none of those have religious causes. Then you go back a bit to things like the American Civil War and the War of Independence, no religious causes. Then you go back even further to things like the Wars of the Roses in England and the Norman Conquest, or you have around the 12th, 13th century, the Mongol conquest, which were incredibly destructive. Again, no religious cause behind those. Go back even further, and you have things like the Punic Wars, Rome versus Carthage, and you have the Persian versus Greek wars. No religious cause behind those. So, in fact, some scholars, Phillips and Axelrod, wrote the Encyclopedia of Wars, had over 1,700 wars they discussed, and only about 120 or so had religion as the main cause. So that's about 7% of the wars had religious cause, 93% didn't. Okay?
Very little.
And of that 7%, only about half of those were Islamic wars. Okay, so not Christian wars.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting. So 93% no religion. So you can't blame religion for most wars. And in fact, only 2% of the deaths from wars can be attributed to the religious wars.
Wow, that is very key, and I don't think people hear that very often. So then, speaking of wars and those people who cause wars and disruptions like war, what about the Crusades? Aren't they an example of the evils committed by the church?
Well, okay, the Crusades do seem to be a religious war. There may have been some idea of being a defensive war because the Muslims had been at war for hundreds of years, taking over the Middle East. In fact, a lot of think of the apostles' journeys and all that. A lot of those places now are Islamic control, but they were once Christian centers. Where Augustine was, where Athanasius was, they were Christian centers, and now they're Islamic places. But I think really that might be a religious war, but even then the deaths are often exaggerated because there's one sort of boastful story that we had enough blood to cover bridles of horses. Okay, well, that sounds bad, and until you realize it's from Revelation chapter 14, where it was clearly an apocalyptic exaggeration. They were quoting the book of Revelation. Everyone understood they weren't meant to be literal.
Okay,
but sort of hundreds of years later, people take it literally and assume, well, this is how bloodthirsty they were. But in fact, you can do the calculations. Even if you only had ankle deep blood in Jerusalem in the temple, you'd have to kill get the blood from 3 million bodies to fill that to that depth, and that's about 100 times the population of Jerusalem at the time. So scientifically it's absurd, but it was never meant to be taken literally.
Wow. Yeah, that definitely puts things into perspective. So I heard growing up that the church is responsible for the Dark Ages. Is that true?
Well, they can't be responsible for the Dark Ages because they never existed. Historians don't use that term. They don't use judgmental term, but also historians realize that the what should be properly called Middle Ages were a period of great advances, innovations in all sorts of different areas. Even in the early parts of the Middle Ages, in the sort of 8th century, you have people like Bede, great scholar, historian. You have the epic Beowulf, basically Old English, so-called Anglo-Saxon, a masterpiece of literature. You have the Lindisfarne Gospels, intricate artwork of the Gospels, and that's sort of early Middle Ages. Then you have William the Conqueror conquering what was then Saxon England, and he did a survey of his new kingdom, the Domesday Book, and there are over 5,000 water mills in Anglo-Saxon England. That's one for every 50 households.
Wow.
The Roman Empire had nothing like that. This is just in England, okay?
Yeah.
And then you go to things like the incredible Gothic cathedrals, architectural works of genius, which are still incredible, some of the best buildings ever in the Middle Ages, when you had flying buttresses and you pointed arch, ribbed vaults. That meant you had extremely open spaces, very stable buildings, incredible, stained glass windows, bathing the worshippers in light and color, okay? And also innovations in literature like Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, Dante's Divine Comedy, architecture. I mentioned the cathedral, also the castle and castle building was also innovative. Well, one of the inventions of the so-called Dark Ages, which should be called the Middle Ages, is the mechanical clock, with an escapement. You have a power source like a falling weight, but you've got to regulate that to produce a timepiece, and you have that with an escapement, and that ticking of your clock is because of the escapement. That was a Dark Ages invention. And a lot of our viewers will be wearing a Dark Ages invention called spectacles, invented in the 13th century. They studied optics and they were the first to invent spectacles. So many things were invented there, but also educationally, because you had the invention of the university modeled on the theological college. That was a medieval invention. And the thing is, they also were not dirty and smelly. They washed daily and they loved public bathhouses were available. They invented soap.
Really?
Yeah, soap is a Middle Ages invention. And they also had recipes for toothpaste and mouthwash. And they used twigs or a rough cloth to clean their teeth. So their teeth were reasonably good. Of course, it helped they had no processed sugar to rot their teeth. And they had a high dairy diet, so calcium is good for your teeth, okay? But just so many things about the Middle Ages that you've heard, just about everything about it you've heard is wrong.
Wow. Very different sort of story than what I gathered growing up in school. So you had told me about Hypatia, and so I wanted to ask you about this one. Was Hypatia murdered by Christians for her learning?
Well, see, the story goes, and you hear that to Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and he wasn't the first to invent this idea. You have this virtuous, brilliant, beautiful woman who is rationalist and secular and teaching all these things, and because of her great learning she was murdered by Christian mobs at the urging of Cyril, who became a saint. And this
what time period?
This is about the 5th century in Alexandria. So about 415, I think, roughly thereabouts, in Alexandria in what's now Egypt. Okay, it was a very prominent city. At one time, it had the Great Library, but even though they want to blame the murder of Hypatia for the destruction of the library was already long gone. Probably Julius Caesar himself is more responsible for the destruction than any Christians were. There wasn't a library to destroy in those days, but supposedly, if you listen to Carl Sagan, it was her death that destroyed the library and ushered in the Dark Ages, which we've already realized never existed.
Right.
But the truth is a lot different from that. I mean, how do we know she was brilliant and virtuous? Because Christian historians told us that. The earliest report was from Socrates Scholasticus, a contemporary, and he was a Christian who clearly admired her and saying that she was so widely admired, people came from afar to hear her. Wow. Okay, and the problem is Alexandria had very vicious politics, okay, and Socrates said that the politics became so vicious that even someone as virtuous and dignified as her got caught up in it because she was a friend of one of the factions. As a sort of friendly advisor, but the mob just pulled her from a chariot and tore her to pieces and burned her body, all that sort of thing. It was pretty nasty. Yeah. The thing is, the Christian Socrates Scholasticus was totally appalled by this. And he said this brought total disrepute on the Christians who took part in it. I mean, because just about everyone was at least a nominal Christian in those days. And he said it brought shame to the Christian community that such a horrible murder should have happened, because totally contrary to the principles of Christianity. Okay. And the other thing is the students of Hypatia, whose names we know were all Christians who admired her. Like you had the future Bishop Synesius, who even after leaving her school, wrote her glowing letters calling her revered mother and teacher and asking her for advice and confiding in her. So the Christians of the day actually admired her very much. And she wasn't such a rationalist. I mean, she would do some things that we would now call superstition. She's very much a very clever lady, not much of an innovator, but in those days, most scholarship was commenting on previous stuff, so she was not second-rate or anything. But then you have this ridiculous film called Agora, which was Agora, and it was meant to be an anti-Christian film and had her as the inventor of the astrolabe and the hydroscope, and even discovered the heliocentric view of the universe and elliptical orbits, which is completely ridiculous. I mean, what she's best known for is commentaries on Ptolemy's astronomy, which was clearly geocentric. That's she and her father worked on that. So there's no way she was a heliocentric astronomer. I mean, so much fantasy gets talked about there. I mean, the murder was terrible, but in fact, a lot of the Christians of the time really objected to it.
Wow. Okay. Well, then moving on to another example, another really dark example, the Inquisition. Wasn't this considered the church's darkest hour?
Well, it's interesting. People think the Inquisition was medieval, but mainly it was what they call the Renaissance. I mean, because the story you learn, you got the 1,000 years of the Dark Ages caused by Christianity, and then you have the glorious Renaissance, got us out of the Dark Ages and produced learning. But then you look at a lot of the things that you attack the medieval times for, they're actually Renaissance or even later. Like, for instance, Salem witch trials, 1692-3, that's basically a so-called Enlightenment. So they're medieval, it's in the almost up to 1700, but spectacles must be Renaissance, even though they're actually 13th century. Okay, so everything you don't like, you call medieval. Everything you do like, you call Renaissance. Okay, but the Inquisition was clearly Renaissance. Okay, I mean, you and I believe freedom of speech. Okay, I support that. Freedom of religion, freedom of speech is quite important to us. Freedom of speech didn't exist anywhere at the time of the Inquisition. The secular people, they didn't have freedom of speech. And in fact, even today, freedom of speech is under severe attack. A lot of the universities have speech codes and there are various laws outlawing parts of speech even today, threatening people with jail time. So freedom of speech is quite a rare thing. Now, I don't like the Inquisition, but it killed maybe only 3,000 people over 300 years. Killing 3,000 people is still 3,000 people too many. No question there, okay? It was a bad thing. But then compared to what? It was probably better than the secular standard of the day. And also where the Inquisition was strong, the witch hysteria was weakest because the Inquisition insisted on rational proof instead of hysterical accusations and superstitions. And that goes right back to the Middle Ages, where the official church position is that witchcraft didn't exist, and therefore you couldn't have witch trial because it never existed. In fact, accusing someone was more likely to get you in trouble because they're accusing someone of a falsehood. Now, just to say, I'm not condoning the Inquisition by any means, okay? So I believe in freedom of religion and freedom of speech, but I do think the secular world has exaggerated it compared to the standard of the time, but also compared to atheist atrocities far more recently.
All right, so far you've done a good job of dealing with some of the lighter examples and the tougher examples of the criticism. We have things like the Crusades, now the Inquisition, we talked about anesthesia, and I want to go one step further and talk about Christian regimes and atheistic regimes. How do deaths for Christian regimes compare to the deaths of the atheistic ones?
Well, I mean, in the 20th century, it was a blood-stained century because you have a lot of these atheistic communist regimes who'd killed millions of their own people in non-war deaths. That's aside from the war deaths. I mean, for instance, the Soviet Gulag state under Stalin and co., they probably killed about 60 million in total. Okay, one of the most appalling examples was called the Holodomor in Ukraine in the 1930s. Holodomor is Ukrainian for murder by starvation. Inquisition. It was a man-made famine that probably cost 4 million people their lives, okay? And then you have Pol Pot, the killing field, the Khmer Rouge, 2 million people murdered because they wore glasses or were educated. Just a horrible amount of deaths. And the anti-Christian Nazi regime, of course, you got the Nazi Holocaust, 6 million Jews, probably about 3 million Poles. I mean, Slavs were also victims, gypsies, homosexuals were victims as well. Okay, but the main thing, of course, is the 6 million Jews wiped out a third of the entire Jewish population of Europe. So, and the Nazi regime was most definitely an anti-Christian regime. I won't call it an atheistic regime, but it was an anti-Christian regime. Well, the communists were officially atheistic regimes. So you may be talking about over 100 million people murdered in the 20th century alone, which is far more. If you add up Crusades, Inquisitions, witch trials, religious wars combined for all previous centuries combined, okay,
right,
that still wouldn't be a drop compared to the atheist atrocities of the 20th century alone.
Yeah, wow. Okay, well then, turning to something besides death and bloodshed, what about slavery? Was the church responsible for creating and spreading slavery?
Well, the problem is slavery is a blot on humanity that existed on every inhabited continent. In fact, every race or people group was both a perpetrator and a victim. The word slave itself comes from the word Slav, who were called a white race in Eastern Europe because they were so often victims of slavery. Okay, and of course, the Greco-Roman world was built on slavery, and most of that existed before the church. How could the church have caused BC slavery? It makes no sense. Slavery definitely pre-existed the church. But so often the critics of Christianity, they will attack the Christian West for something that wasn't unique to the Christian West, which is slavery, but they refuse to give credit to what was unique, and that was the abolition of slavery. It was basically only in the Christian world that the idea of slavery became unthinkable because, see, people like Aristotle, the great Greek philosopher, he regarded some people as natural slaves. So did the leading Roman philosophers and writers. They supported slavery. It was only people in the church like Gregory of Nyssa in the 4th century. He thought it was wrong in principle to own someone made in God's image. So there's no such thing to him as benevolent slave owners because slavery itself was abhorrent. Okay, and therefore in the Middle Ages, Middle Ages Europe, there wasn't slavery. You had the medieval serfs who had more rights than the Greco-Roman slaves could even dream of, okay, and they were enforceable rights. But then you have the discovery of the New World by Europe, and so there's a slave trade, but who were in opposition? Mainly it was the Christians, people who would now be called the religious right. I mean, see, William Paley's best known for his sort of watchmaker argument for design, but he also denounced slavery as odious at a time when slavery was unfortunately widely accepted again. And then you have people like William Wilberforce and his colleagues fighting for decades to abolish slavery. And you had people telling them, well, hey, how dare you insert your religion into politics? Keep your religion out of politics. That sounds so familiar today. But eventually they succeeded in making slavery unthinkable. And then the British Navy enforced its anti-slavery morality on other nations. So they arrested slave-carrying ships and hanged the leaders sometimes. Okay, so they enforced anti-slavery on everywhere else. Okay, so the church was basically unique in getting rid of slavery. And now slavery is unthinkable. It's an unthinkable evil in places where the church has been strong. It took a long time for slavery to be abolished in Islamic countries, but in the West it was abolished by the mid-19th century.
Why do you think that the Islamic countries even abolished it if they were not Christian? What was the influence there?
Well, often it was because of the Christian, at least the Western world was stronger, so it could enforce their abolition, like the Barbary pirates on the North African coast. They would kidnap slaves from Europe. So they had a big European slave trade in the Barbary coast, but then they made the mistake of tangling with America, the new nation of America. So Jefferson sent the Navy in and basically splattered the Barbary pirates, and that was the end of their slave empire because it showed how weak they were. Like if you think of the Marine hymn, to the shores of Tripoli, that was referring to an event in that that time, because Tripoli's in the North African coast.
Okay, so the Bible is definitely opposed to the American-style slavery that we had in the continent of North America. So what happened there?
Well, you see, the Bible is quite clear that you are not allowed to kidnap someone for slavery, okay? But the slavery from the Middle Passage, first of all, unfortunately, in the sort of deepest parts of Africa, there are all sorts of tropical diseases that Europeans were very vulnerable to, so they could not venture into these interior parts of Africa. So it's often the Africans who captured other Africans in tribal wars and sold them on to the Europeans. But the thing is, kidnapping for slavery is explicitly forbidden in the Old Testament, and Paul denounces the man-stealers in the New Testament, so that is automatically against the Middle Passage. But also, the Old Testament says that you don't return an escaped slave to his master, because you've got sanctuary cities for escaped slaves. But America had the Fugitive Slave Act, which demanded return of slaves to their masters. You see how the Old Testament and New Testament actually opposed the American style of slavery, and also generational slavery was not allowed, because there's a limit to how you could have people undergoing voluntary slavery for a time to pay a debt, but the idea of lifetime and then generational slavery, that's also anti-biblical. So the particular type of American slavery was definitely forbidden in the Bible. And there are a number of Christians who understood that. I mean, the great British preacher Charles Spurgeon was hated by the slave owners in the American South before the war. They detested him because he denounced slavery so passionately.
So why is it that there is so much in the scripture that seems to be laws regulating slavery in the Old Testament if they're not condoning it?
Well, okay, I mean, the word slave can have different meanings, okay? I mean, people see the word slave in the Old Testament, they think of the American antebellum slavery, but often that was not what was being discussed. I mean, for instance, as far as the biblical language was concerned, see, the president's cabinet today, those cabinet members would be called as slaves. Okay, so it had a fairly much wider meaning, and a lot of what they call slavery might be indentured servitude, so not really slavery in the way we think about it. So it was indentured servitude to pay off a debt, for instance. They went into it voluntarily, and they were supposed to end after 7 years, so it wasn't a permanent system. And also regulated the idea that slave masters had, there was a limit to how they could treat their slaves, unlike the Greco-Roman world where they could be crucified as part of it. Another slave did a crime, they could crucify all the slaves in that Roman owner, and the Roman ethicists and philosophers were fine with that. Okay, the Bible would not allow that sort of thing. And then when you have Paul condemning the kidnappers, the man-stealers, and also Onesimus and Philemon, his letter to Philemon was basically a really strong hint that you should free Philemon as a brother. Paul condemned the man-stealers, the kidnappers, because, I mean, even owning a kidnapped slave was a capital crime in the Mosaic law. But then he wrote a letter to Philemon because he had an escaped slave called Onesimus who came to Paul, converted to the Christianity, and Paul was trying to keep relations with Philemon, but was basically saying, well, yeah, take this to your master Philemon, but he basically all but told Philemon to free Onesimus without necessarily saying so in so many words, but basically everything in that letter is saying you really should free him. He's a brother in Christ. You should treat him as an equal, okay? And from that, you go to Gregory of Nyssa, who went even further, but basically took Paul to his logical conclusion and said you shouldn't be owning slaves at all.
Okay, wow. Well, then moving on from slavery, another one that just feels kind of bizarre, but it's got to be answered is people say that Adolf Hitler was a Christian.
Oh, goodness. A number of memes going around on the internet about Hitler was a Christian, because there are times when in his early campaigns, he would say things like, as a Christian, I do such and such. But the thing is, Germany was largely nominally Christian. I mean, I think it wasn't as Christian as people think it was. So like that we have on our website an article by a quote from Ernst Mayr, famous evolutionist who grew up in Germany. He said fundamentalist Christianity was almost non-existent, which by he means Christianity that takes the Bible seriously was almost non-existent in his growing up. He was born in 1904, okay? But the thing is, Hitler was a minority person at first, and therefore he's trying to sort of not alienate at least the nominal Christians and even the true Christians. But I mean, if Hitler was a Christian, it means he worshipped a Jew. Does that sound much like Hitler to you?
It doesn't make much sense.
Makes sense. Okay, that's a ridiculous thing. But also Hitler didn't believe any of the doctrines of Christianity. He didn't believe Jesus rose from the dead, certainly didn't believe Jesus is God. He didn't believe Jesus was Jewish either. He thought he was some sort of Aryan. So he didn't believe he was virgin born, didn't believe he saved mankind from our sins. So he believed none of the doctrines of Christianity. So this is not a no true Scotsman fallacy, okay? See, it's like a Scotsman someone who claims to be a Scotsman but has never been to Scotland, never born in Scotland, has no Scottish ancestry, has no interest in Scottish culture, but claims to be a Scotsman. That's what we're talking about when you say Hitler was a Christian. He had none of the attributes of Christianity, but of course also his actions were diametrically opposed to Christianity.
Wow.
He hated Christians, in fact. After the Nuremberg trials, you have General William Donovan, the American general. He compiled a huge amount of documents that show that the Nazis planned to exterminate Christianity had they won World War II. So first the Jews, then it was the Christians who were next on the chopping block. And in fact, even the death camps and concentration camps like Dachau, there was a whole priest and pastor block in Dachau where dissident priests and pastors were put in these concentration camps.
Okay. Well, you've done a lot throughout this entire conversation to defend Christianity throughout history, the last 2,000 years of history. And now I'm just wondering, are you saying that Christianity and the church are not responsible for any bad things? Isn't there evidence that Christianity is bad somehow?
I wouldn't want to commit a no true Scotsman fallacy myself. Unfortunately, some Christians do bad things, okay? In fact, even the Bible is not shy of admitting the grievous faults of some of its heroes of the faith. King David, adultery and murder, for instance. The apostles became cowardly and denied Jesus. Paul was a massive persecutor of Christians and murderer of Christians before he became a Christian himself, okay? So the Bible does talk about some bad things done by even the heroes of the faith. So we're sinful people, we're redeemed, but we're not fully sanctified, okay, yet. So Christians can do bad things. But I will say that what they do is inconsistent with Christianity. It is contrary to the teaching of Christ. Well, see, if an atheist does bad things, he's not inconsistent with atheistic philosophy. I'm not saying atheists are always going to be bad people or can't be good people. I don't say that, but I'm saying if we're rearranged pond scum and the result of survival of the fittest and the strong overpowering the weak, where is the actual basis for good, to talk about good and evil? I mean, Richard Dawkins wrote an article, if you understand British comedy, it's a comedy called Fawlty Towers, and Basil Fawlty actually beats his car for not starting, and Dawkins wrote an article, why do we laugh at Basil's beating his car? Well, shouldn't we just as much laugh at a judge who punishes a criminal? Because we're also, in his view, we're just biological machines, where good and evil are just as illusory as attributing good or evil to a motor car, okay? So he's a leading evolutionist, of course, so I'm not sort of straw manning. I'm actually, here's a top evolutionist saying that there's no ultimate good or evil if evolution is true. Now, Dawkins then, of course, says that teaching creation to children is evil. Okay, he says there's no such thing as evil, then he says that teaching creation is evil. Go figure. But that's the point. The atheists who commit atrocities are not inconsistent with atheism, while the Christians who commit atrocities are being inconsistent with Christianity.
Okay, and I don't think it's fair to raise all of the opposition and create a defense without also looking at the other side of the coin. What are some of the good things that Christianity has done for the world?
Well, it's interesting that infanticide was very common in the Greco-Roman world, not just in Sparta, but even later than the height of Sparta. And if they didn't like the infant, it was not perfect in some way, they would just leave it to die on the hillside. And one imperfection is the baby's born a girl. They wanted sons, not daughters. So girl babies were often left there. But when the Christians came to the area and grew, the Christians rescued these babies from being left to die on the hillside. So infanticide dropped when Christianity took over an area, but also they could measure the rights of women really came up when Christianity had come to the area, because Christianity had a lot of radical ideas. I mean, okay, Paul tells you things like the wife's obligation to her husband. That wasn't radical because that's what the Romans thought. The wives had obligations. But Paul also said the husband has obligations to his wife too, to be faithful to his wife, and treat his wife, like his own body. See, that was radical. And so where Christianity rose, so do the rights of women, so rights of children. And then you have, as I said, about abolition of slavery was basically a Christian thing. The development of learning, because if you can read a classical Greek or Roman manuscript, thank the Christians who preserved it and copied it. They preserved a lot of the classical learning, and they founded universities to develop this learning. They also were responsible for the rise of a lot of modern science. Most founders of modern science were Christians, and the Christian church was largely responsible for the first hospitals and orphanages in the world. So, and even more recently, you have some atheists in the UK, quite prominent atheists, and one admitted the Salvation Army has done so much good for the poor and downtrodden in the world, and there are no comparable atheist aid societies. And another guy, Matthew Paris, another atheist, he said, I'm an atheist, but I say Africa needs God. Okay. It's the Christians who are going to get Africa out of a lot of the grinding poverty that still unfortunately exists in Africa. More than material aid, is the Christian mindset that will be responsible for lifting Africa out, as it has done for the Western world hundreds of years before.
Okay, and along these lines, in the list of the things that they have done well for the world, what about education, classical education?
Well, again, the church who preserved a lot of the classical education. You have things like the trivium. There are three arts, and you have the quadrivium, which are four other arts. So 7 basic liberal arts, and the church in their schools, they would teach these things. And in fact, what's called the Carolingian Renaissance in the 8th century under Charlemagne. See, he may not have been able to read, but he realized reading was important. And so he got a clergyman, a monk from England, what's now England, Alcuin, to teach them how to read and educate. So in fact, Alcuin was responsible for the Carolingian Renaissance under Charlemagne, and then his grandson Otto, another Renaissance. And there was a church who often really were interested in getting some of the manuscripts from the Arab world when they had contacts with the Arab lands. And those Arabs had at first got those manuscripts from the Christians in the area. The Christians preserved them. The Arabs liked them translated into Arabic, and then they got them back into the Christian world. So it was, the church actually helped to rediscover a lot of classical learning, but also built on it too. It didn't stop there. They actually extended and improved it.
So are there any other industrial inventions that Christianity are responsible for that promoted culture and prosperity?
Well, a lot of the things in the Middle Ages promoted prosperity, like the heavy plough and agriculture, which is why they could actually grow far more food. And see, the population in the Middle Ages was about 3 times that of the Roman Empire because of their improvements in agriculture. And then you have more of a framework. You see, you have to have a framework of sort of private property rights. The Bible says, "Do not steal." That implies private property rights, and that the government should be there to protect private property rights, under which there's incentive to save and grow and invest for the future when you have that framework that your investments are going to be protected as private property. See, if the government could take as it pleased, and there was no protection against criminals, then there's no incentive to invest for the future in the machinery that's necessary for things to go ahead. And a lot of medical advances were made by Bible believers too, as well. I've mentioned anesthesia, but also antiseptic surgery by Joseph Lister, which otherwise surgery would cause as many deaths as whatever it was trying to treat because of the infection rate. But Joseph Lister saved lives because he understood that life comes only from life. So therefore infection comes from outside. So you have an antiseptic spray to stop the infection getting into the wound, and that saved so many lives there. Okay, wow. So many inventions. And then in more modern times, the late Dr. Raymond Damadian invented the MRI. He was the one who made it possible, because he was the one who discovered a difference in if you want to be technical, it's called the relaxation time between diseased and healthy tissue. And because of that very clear difference, he realized it was possible to make an image. So without his discovery, there'd be nothing to image. And the MRI could not work. So he is the main discoverer. He's the one who should have got the Nobel Prize, because he was the scientist who discovered the contrast that made everything possible. And he was a biblical creationist. He believed in six-day creation.
Yeah. Okay, so, wow, this has been a really excellent conversation. But it also begs the question, why does Christianity even exist in the first place?
Well, actually, when you look at the history of the first century, see, Christianity had so many things against it. It went against so many of the mores of the time. And in fact, what they call the word excruciating comes from out off the cross. That's what the word excruciating means. It was a horrible punishment. But the main thing in that world was the shame of crucifixion. So the idea of a shame God would be impossible to start a religion, except the only thing that could have actually got Christianity going was historical evidence that he conquered death. Incontrovertible evidence that he rose from the dead. Without that evidence, there's no way Christianity could have got off the ground. Okay, and that's the main reason we should believe Christianity, not because of the amazingly good fruits it's produced, but because it happens to be true. And because it's true, it means that we have an answer to the sin problem, the ultimate answer to the problem. Why are we here? Because we have a creator God who made us in his image. What are we supposed to do? Well, we've got the commands he's written for us in his word, the Bible. But also, well, how can we become right with him? Well, we don't have to, because God has done everything. He took on human nature in Jesus Christ to pay the penalty we deserve. And he proved his credentials by rising incontrovertibly from the dead. And that's the only way Christianity could have got off the ground. And it's the ultimate answer for why we're in the problem we are, and the solution for it. And our ultimate destiny is all provided by the Christian worldview.
Incredible. So taking all this into consideration, we've discussed a lot of things, and I'm sure that people would like to learn more, to pick up the thread and look at more of these ideas and explore the topic much further than we can here in one podcast. Mm-hmm. Is there any book that you would like to recommend for people that want to take it further? Okay.
Well, I co-authored a book called Christianity for Skeptics. I'm the secondary author under Steve Kumar. And see, this is a book explaining why it's rational to believe in God as the creator, but also the source of morality, and also why Jesus is the one true way to God, and how he showed it by rising from the dead. And we also go into alternatives. I mean, what are some alternatives? Like atheism is an alternate religion. They don't want to admit it's a religion, but it is. And also, I say Islam is a big alternate religion, but so are things like the New Age, which is basically some of the Eastern Hindu, Buddhist philosophies. So we have chapters answering some of these alternatives that people present against Christianity. But the thing is, the difference between founders of other religions and Jesus is that they are still in their tombs. Jesus' tomb was empty. And that is a huge reason to trust Christianity over all the other religions.
Excellent. So what's the name of the book again?
Christianity for Skeptics.
Okay. And if you want to get a hold of a copy of this book, a link will be available with this podcast down in the description. Dr. Sarfati, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Joseph.